It took one sentence and a declassified bombshell to flip the entire room. The tension in that Senate chamber was so thick, you could feel it through the television screen. Kamala Harris, confident, unflinching, demanded answers. But no one, not even her closest aides, could have predicted how J.D. Vance would respond. In a moment that still haunts the halls of Congress today, he rose, revealed the truth no one saw coming, and left a room of seasoned lawmakers in stunned, breathless silence. But what drove him to that point? What battles did he fight behind closed doors before that fateful day? And at what cost did that loyalty come? This is the story of courage, strategy, and a loyalty tested like never before. A story shaped from imagination, but carrying truths that feel all too real. The names are familiar, the emotions are universal, and while the events you'll hear are dramatized, they invite us to ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to stand firm when everything is on the line? Join us on this journey and ask yourself, what would you do if loyalty cost you everything? The air in the Senate chamber was electric, that heavy, charged silence that settles over a room just before something irreversible happens. The gallery above was packed wall to wall, senators, aides, journalists, activists, and curious citizens who had lined up before dawn just for a glimpse of what everyone knew would be a confrontation to remember. The bright glare of media lights reflected off polished oak desks and the gleaming brass fixtures. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, and somewhere, a cough echoed too loud in the hush. J.D. Vance stepped into the chamber, his posture straight, his expression composed. But beneath that exterior, his thoughts raced like a storm trapped in a bottle. His mind flashed through headlines he'd seen that morning. Vance's foreign policy, votes under fire. Is J.D. Vance playing a dangerous game? He took a slow breath, willing himself to remember every lesson his grandfather had taught him, about standing tall when the world wanted you to bow. He felt the weight of every eye in the room. Somewhere in the sea of faces, a veteran with medals pinned to his chest watched him with narrowed eyes. A teacher from his home state clutched a notebook, ready to scribble down whatever history might be made. J.D. gave no sign that he noticed them. But he did, everyone. And then she spoke. Vice President Kamala Harris, presiding over the hearing with the easy confidence of someone used to command, began with words that were polite, almost soft, but each syllable carried an edge, like silk wrapped around steel. Senator Vance, she began, her voice measured, clear, inviting. Let's discuss your recent votes on trade policy, on defense appropriations, on foreign aid. She smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. The American people, I'm sure, are eager to understand the reasoning behind your positions. J.D. met her gaze, nodding once, as if to say, proceed. What followed felt like a dance, polite, precise, but with undertones of something far more dangerous. Kamala asked about his vote against a funding bill that included military support for allies in the Pacific. J.D. answered, calmly, firmly, pointing out flaws in the bill's language, hidden pork barrel spending, unintended loopholes that could be exploited by adversaries. His voice carried steady, no anger, no defensiveness, just facts layered with conviction. But with each question, the room's temperature seemed to drop. Kamala's queries became sharper, her phrasing more exacting, as if she were tightening a net. Senator, you claim these votes reflect your commitment to American workers and security. But isn't it true that your decisions could weaken our standing on the global stage? That they could embolden those who wish us harm? J.D. felt the pulse of the room shift. He could see it in the way pens paused over notepads, the way camera lenses zoomed in closer. The audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were waiting for the stumble, the misstep, the crack in his armor. And J.D., he felt it too, the temptation to lash out, to answer fire with fire. But instead, he drew a slow breath. His voice, when it came, was steady as stone. My loyalty to this nation, Vice President Harris, is measured not by how loudly I vote for what's popular, but by how hard I fight for what's right. The words hung in the air, weighty, final. But Kamala didn't flinch. She merely smiled that same smile, as if she'd expected nothing less. The questions continued, each one designed not just to probe his policies, but to chip at his image, to force a slip that could be replayed in headlines, in attack ads, in the whispered conversations of power. And all the while, JD answered as a man standing on a narrow bridge in a storm, focused, balanced, knowing one wrong step could send him crashing down. And the people watching, both in the chamber and on screens across the nation, leaned in just a little closer, because they could feel it. Something was building. The polite dance of words was only the beginning. The real storm had yet to break. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as the polite volley of questions reached its peak. JD's last answer, steady, measured, defiant in its quiet conviction, had landed with the weight of a man unwilling to bend. For a brief moment, it felt as if the storm might pass, that the session would end as just another day in the theater of politics. But Kamala Harris wasn't finished, and JD, despite all his preparation, didn't see the shift coming. Not like this. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softening in a way that, to the untrained ear, might have sounded like empathy. But those who knew the game, who had played in these halls of power long enough, recognized it for what it was, the tightening of the trap. The room, sensing it too, grew impossibly still. The scratch of pens halted. The faint hum of cameras seemed louder in the silence. Even the shifting of bodies in the gallery stopped, as if the weight of anticipation pressed them into place. "Senator Vance," Kamala began, her tone as smooth as polished glass, "I appreciate your thoughtful answers. I truly do. And I believe the American people deserve representatives who are willing to explain themselves as you have today." She paused, not long, but just enough for tension to coil tighter. "But given your recent record, votes that, let's be honest, have raised concerns not just here at home, but among our allies, I have to ask," her eyes locked onto his, steady, unblinking, "can the American people truly count on your loyalty?" The words fell into the chamber like a thunderclap, louder than any shout. For a heartbeat, maybe two, the world seemed to stop. There was no sound beyond the soft, collective gasp that rose from the gallery, a ripple of shock that passed through the room like a shiver. The veteran who had watched JD so intently earlier shifted in his seat, brows furrowed. The teacher's pen trembled above her notebook. Somewhere, a camera operator cursed under his breath, realizing he hadn't zoomed in tight enough to capture JD's face at that precise instant. But the other cameras had. Every flicker of surprise that crossed JD's features, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the brief parting of his lips as if to speak but finding no words, was caught in high-definition clarity. He felt the heat of the lights, the weight of those lenses trained on him, the collective hunger of the room for his response. Inside, JD's mind raced. The question, no, the accusation, veiled though it was, echoed in his ears. He had expected tough questions, pointed critiques. He had braced for challenges to his votes, his policies, his principles. But this was different. This wasn't about a policy disagreement. This was about his character, his honor, and it had been delivered with the precision of a dagger aimed straight at the heart. For the briefest of moments, he was silent. Not because he had no answer, but because he understood that whatever he said next would define not just this hearing, but how he would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. He could feel it, that invisible line, the one between politics as usual and the kind of moment that gets carved into history. And as the tension thickened, as the gallery leaned forward, as the nation watched through glowing screens in living rooms and offices and bars across America, JD drew a slow, steadying breath. The storm was here. The next move was his. The storm didn't wait for the hearing to end. Even before JD Vance rose from his seat, even before the gavel echoed through the chamber to mark the close of proceedings, it had begun. The words, "Can the American people truly count on your loyalty?" replayed on screens across the nation. Clipped, repeated, dissected. News banners flashed crimson and gold on every major network. Harris questions Vance's loyalty to the U.S. Loyalty in the spotlight, Vance under fire. The talking heads wasted no time. The first analyses were already spilling out of mouths still warm from coffee. eager to seize the moment, to shape it before the dust even began to settle. Outside the chamber, the chaos took physical form. Reporters crowded the marble steps, jostling for position as JD emerged, the weight of 1,000 lenses and microphones suddenly upon him. The afternoon sun caught the glint of camera glass, casting sharp, fragmented reflections across the faces of the press. Questions flew like arrows, each one aimed to pierce, to provoke, to capture a reaction they could package and replay until the next scandal took its place. Senator Vance, do you deny the vice president's accusation? Senator, is there any truth to these concerns about your loyalty? JD, will you resign? But JD said nothing. His face, so practiced at hiding the storm within, remained unreadable. His gaze stayed fixed ahead, each step deliberate, each breath measured. Inside, the echoes of Kamala's words still rang in his ears, not as a simple accusation, but as a challenge that would demand an answer greater than any soundbite he could offer on those steps. And so he walked, through the gauntlet of flashing bulbs and shouted questions, his silence speaking louder than any statement could in that moment. Online, the fire spread faster than even the most seasoned strategists could contain. Within minutes, #VanceLoyalty shot to the top of trending lists, a digital wildfire consuming feeds, timelines, and comment threads. The posts came in waves, supporters defending him with passion, citing his record, his speeches, his roots in small-town America. Critics seized the moment, framing him as evasive, as a man cornered by his own contradictions. Memes sprang up with lightning speed, some mocking, some rallying, all feeding the hunger of an audience addicted to outrage and revelation. Screens in bars flickered with his image. Radios replayed the exchange on endless loop. Podcasts began recording emergency episodes to weigh in on the controversy while it was still hot. And through it all, JD walked, not hurried, not hiding, but carrying the invisible burden of knowing that the battle he had entered wasn't just political. It was personal now, the kind of accusation that clings, that shapes how history remembers a name. Finally, the marble corridors of the Capitol fell away behind him, and JD reached his office. The door clicked shut, muffling the noise, the questions, the storm that raged beyond its walls. For a moment, he stood in the quiet, his back to the room, his hands resting on the windowsill. Outside, the Capitol dome glowed in the late afternoon light, majestic and unyielding. JD stared at it, his reflection faint in the glass. A man who had always believed in service, now forced to question how that belief would be measured, and by whom. And as JD stood at his window, watching the city wrestle with the storm his silence had unleashed, his mind reached for steadier ground. The boy he once was, shaped not by politics, but by the quiet lessons of Middletown, Ohio. The reflection in the window held his gaze longer than he meant it to. The Capitol dome beyond stood solid, unmoving, while his own image seemed to flicker. A man caught between the weight of accusation and the memory of who he was before all this began. And as JD stared at that faint outline of himself, another face rose in his mind. The boy he had once been, long before the chamber, the cameras, the questions. A boy from Middletown, Ohio. A boy shaped not by politics, but by calloused hands, grease-stained overalls, and lessons taught in the glow of a single work lamp. He could see it as clear as yesterday. The old garage out back of his grandfather's house. The smell of motor oil and pine shavings mingling in the cool air. The steady creak of the rocking chair where his grandfather sat on quiet evenings. Pipe in hand, eyes watching not just JD, but the world beyond. And JD, no more than 10, kneeling on the cracked concrete floor beside a rusted-out Chevy truck they'd been fixing for what felt like forever. His hands small, clumsy, but eager. His heart wide open, drinking in every word the old man spoke. "Son," his grandfather would say, voice low and sure, "you don't measure a man by what he says when folks are listening. You measure him by what he does when no one is." The words weren't fancy. They didn't have the polish of a Senate speech or a soundbite. But they stuck. They became the compass by which JD tried to live, even now, even when that compass seemed to spin beneath the storm of Washington. Above the workbench, hung with care in a simple wooden frame, was the flag that draped his father's casket. JD remembered the day they folded it with military precision, the way it seemed too big for his small hands to help hold, the way his mother's tears soaked into the cloth. That flag wasn't just fabric, it was promise. It was sacrifice. It was the reason JD understood, from a young age, that loyalty wasn't a word you said. It was a thing you lived, a thing you proved. Middletown wasn't a place of wealth or power or prestige. It was a place of mills and factories, of men and women who rose before dawn and came home after dark, hands rough, backs sore, but spirits unbroken. JD learned loyalty from them too, in the way neighbors showed up without being asked, in the way debts were repaid not with money, but with deeds, in the way people stood by each other when times got hard. Those small-town values didn't come with headlines or applause, but they built a foundation stronger than any title or office. Now standing alone in his office, JD drew a breath and turned from the window, his reflection fading back into the night beyond. The boy from Middletown wasn't gone. He lived still in the man, in the quiet resolve that no accusation could erase. The world might question his loyalty, but JD knew where it had been forged, in a garage, in a flag, in a town that taught him what it truly meant to belong to something greater than himself. And as the storm raged on beyond the walls, those lessons whispered steady in his heart. The fight ahead would test him, but the boy from Middletown was ready. The boy from Middletown had grown into a man, but those early lessons didn't fade as JD stepped into the wider world. If anything, they became the backbone of every decision he made, especially when the world offered him easier roads. He could still remember the first of those crossroads, fresh out of law school, standing in a sleek glass office, overlooking a city skyline that seemed to promise everything. The firm wanted him, badly. The money was more than he'd ever imagined as a kid scraping rust off old tools in his grandfather's garage. The path was clear. Sign the contract, climb the ladder, live a life of comfort. But JD couldn't shake the voice that echoed inside him, the voice of the man who taught him what loyalty meant, what duty required. And so he walked away. Walked from the high rise, the corner office, the big paycheck. Walked toward public service, a path that offered less in wealth, but more in purpose. It wasn't glamorous. The offices were smaller, the suits cheaper, the days longer. But JD never regretted it, because in those halls, in those community centers, in those late-night meetings with people who felt forgotten by the powerful, he saw where he was meant to be. It wasn't long before politics called, not the politics of photo ops and applause lines, but the politics of hard choices, of standing in rooms where his voice shook because he was the only one willing to say what no one else would. He remembered one of those early battles like it was yesterday, a bill that promised jobs but hid poison in its fine print, loopholes that would let corporations ship work overseas while claiming tax breaks at home. His colleagues urged him to vote yes. "It's good optics, son," they said. "You'll win points with the right people." But JD saw the cost. He saw the faces of the workers he'd met in Middletown, in places just like it, the people who had built this country with their hands and asked for nothing more than a fair shot. He voted no. The backlash was swift. Headlines called him naive, reckless. Donors disappeared. Allies grew distant. But JD held the line. And in the quiet of that storm, when he questioned whether he'd done the right thing, another voice rose in his memory. Not his grandfather's this time, but the voice of an old mentor from his earliest days in service, a man who'd seen more fights lost than won, but kept going anyway. "You'll be tested, JD. Loyalty isn't proved in words. It's proved in fire." Those words became his armor. With every vote that cost him politically, with every stand that earned him criticism instead of applause, JD remembered loyalty wasn't to a party or to donors or to polls. It was to the people who didn't have a voice loud enough to be heard over the noise. It was to the promises he made, to his town, his family, himself. Now, standing at this new crossroads, facing accusations that cut deeper than any headline ever had, JD felt the weight of those choices behind him like a shield. He hadn't chosen the easy path then. He wouldn't choose it now. And as the storm outside his office window raged on, as the nation debated his name and his worth, JD's resolve only hardened. The next chapter of this fight would demand everything he had, but he was ready. Night fell heavy over the city, but sleep would not come. The storm outside JD's window had long since quieted, but inside it raged on. The chamber's echoes, the sting of Kamala Harris's words. "Can the American people truly count on your loyalty?" played over and over in his mind, as relentless as the ticking of the clock on the wall. He had faced hard choices before, had withstood the judgment of colleagues and commentators, but this accusation struck deeper, as if it aimed not at his policies, but at the core of who he was. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room, where JD sat alone, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. Outside, the Capitol dome glowed softly against the night sky, a constant reminder of the stage on which this battle was now playing out. His heart felt heavy, but it was the kind of weight he knew couldn't be ignored, couldn't be wished away. He needed clarity. He needed calm. And it came, as it always did, in the quiet footsteps that approached from the hallway. His wife paused at the doorway, watching him for a moment before crossing the room and sitting beside him. No words at first, just the shared silence of two people who had weathered storms together before. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, the voice of home. "I know who you are," she said simply, reaching for his hand. "And the people who matter know too." JD felt his chest tighten, not from pain, but from the swell of gratitude for the woman beside him. The one who had seen every part of this journey, who knew the weight he carried better than anyone. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. But the question hung between them, unspoken but present. Would that be enough? The debate that had churned in his mind all night rose again. Stay silent. Let the noise pass. Let the headlines shift to the next target. Let his record speak for itself. Or fight back. Risk more attention, more scrutiny, but reclaim the narrative before it was written for him by those eager to see him fall. He stared at the floor as if the answer might be carved into the wood grain beneath his feet. His wife squeezed his hand, as if she sensed the storm inside him. "You've always known what the right thing is. You just have to listen for it." And in that moment, JD realized the choice ahead wasn't just about politics. It wasn't about headlines or polls. It was about the promise he'd made. To himself, to his family, to that boy in Middletown who had once knelt in a garage and learned that loyalty is proved in fire. The next move would define not just his future, but the truth of who he was. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, JD sat a little straighter. The weight remained, but the path forward was becoming clear. The fight was far from over, and he was ready to meet it head-on. The first rays of dawn brought no peace. If anything, they sharpened the storm. JD had barely risen from his sleepless vigil when the world outside his walls began to weigh in. The television in the corner of the living room flickered to life, unbidden almost, as if the house itself knew that silence was no longer an option. And there, across every network, Kamala Harris's words played on an endless loop. Clipped, dissected, replayed until they felt burned into the air itself. "Can the American people truly count on your loyalty?" News banners screamed variations of the same message. Loyalty in question, Vance evasive on national stage. Senate firestorm, Vance under siege. The faces of anchors, some grave, some eager, filled the screen, their voices weaving narratives as if the verdict had already been decided. They didn't replay JD's answers, his steady defense, the conviction in his tone. They played the silence. That split-second pause when Kamala's challenge struck. That flicker of emotion the cameras had caught. That was the image being sold now. Not a man of principle, but a man cornered, uncertain, exposed. JD stood motionless, watching. He didn't change the channel. There was no point. It was the same everywhere. His name, his face, his reputation, all fed into the machine of outrage and analysis. Each pundit's voice layered on the next, each headline louder, each scroll of the ticker more biting. And as the minutes passed, the storm spread. Social media swelled with commentary, hashtags, memes, accusations. His phone buzzed constantly on the table, but he left it untouched. He knew what waited there. Statements from staffers, calls from advisors, questions from reporters, messages from friends who weren't sure where to stand anymore. And that was when the real blow began to land. Not from the news, not from strangers online, but from those he had once counted as allies. A senator he'd worked with on worker protections released a cautious statement about the importance of loyalty in public office. A representative he'd campaigned for tweeted that it was time for JD to clarify his positions for the good of the country. Even a longtime supporter, a man who'd once introduced JD at rallies as a fighter for the forgotten, went on air and suggested that maybe the scrutiny was warranted, that maybe JD had lost his way. JD felt each distancing word like a fresh cut. He had expected political attacks. He had braced for headlines. But this, the retreat of those he'd stood beside in battle, this was harder. He turned from the screen, the images of his own face frozen mid-reaction, and crossed the room to the window, where the city below was waking to another day of noise and judgment. The Capitol dome stood steady as ever, but to JD it seemed more distant now, as if the building itself watched in quiet disapproval. He didn't speak. There was no speech that could drown out the storm outside, no statement that could undo what was already in motion. But inside, beneath the weight of betrayal and the roar of voices eager to tear him down, something in JD hardened. The boy from Middletown, the man who had chosen service over comfort, the one who had kept his word when it cost him, that part of him stepped forward now. The media could turn, allies could fall away, but the fight was far from over, and JD Vance wasn't finished yet. The morning wore on, the storm outside refusing to break. By mid-morning, JD found himself in a room that felt both familiar and foreign, his inner sanctum, now turned battlefield. The office conference space, usually reserved for quiet strategy sessions and policy reviews, had become the war room. His closest advisors gathered around the heavy oak table, their faces drawn, their voices hushed but urgent. Beyond the tall windows, the Capitol loomed, its white dome brilliant against the cloudless sky, a stark contrast to the storm that swirled within these walls. JD stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, his gaze heavy on the stack of folders in front of him. The classified mission files. The ones that held the truth no one beyond this room yet knew. The ones that, if revealed, might clear his name or burn bridges that could never be rebuilt. "We need to talk options," his chief of staff began, breaking the heavy silence. The man's voice was measured, but JD could hear the strain beneath. "We can stay the course. Let this ride out. The media will move on. They always do." A younger advisor shook her head. "They won't move on. Not this time. This accusation, it sticks. It's not just about policy anymore. It's about you, about what people believe you stand for." Another voice joined in, older, grayer, a longtime strategist who'd seen more campaigns won and lost than anyone else in the room. "There is a way out, but it comes at a price." His eyes flicked to the files on the table. "Declassification. You reveal the mission, the real reason behind the votes they're questioning. You show the country you were working to protect them all along." JD didn't move. The room felt smaller now, the weight of what they were considering settling like stone on his shoulders. He knew the cost. To reveal that mission meant exposing operations meant to stay in the shadows, possibly putting future defenses at risk. It meant giving up a layer of protection for those still out there on the front lines of intelligence work. But to stay silent, to let the lie fester, meant watching his name, his promise, his loyalty drag through the mud, unchecked. A quiet voice spoke from the corner, a policy aide JD trusted like family. "Sir, if you do this, you can't take it back. The press will feast on it. Our enemies will study it. Future missions could be compromised. Are you willing to risk that?" JD stared at the files, the silence stretching as his mind worked through the maze of consequences, weighing duty to country against duty to truth. And then the words came, low but certain. "We can't let a lie define me." He looked up, meeting every gaze around the table. "We do this right. We protect what we can, but we tell the truth." The room fell still, the decision settling like a final stone placed on a monument. His team exchanged glances, some relieved, some worried, all aware that the path ahead would be steep and treacherous. But the course was set. J.D. Vance had made his choice. Outside, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the Capitol grounds. Inside, in that quiet war room, a new kind of battle had begun, one where truth would be both weapon and shield, and where the cost of loyalty would soon be revealed to the world. The decision made, the action followed swiftly. J.D. sat at his desk, the familiar grain of the wood beneath his fingertips, somehow grounding him as he signed his name to the formal request. The document, crisp and precise, bore the weight of what it asked, that the Pentagon declassify key portions of his national security work. Not everything, not the names of those still in harm's way, or the tactics that shielded the country from threats unseen, but enough. Enough to reveal the truth of why he had cast those controversial votes, why he had stood firm when so many others questioned or abandoned him. Enough to defend not just his reputation, but the integrity of his promise to serve. The ink dried quickly, but the consequences would not. As the courier carried the envelope into the night, J.D. felt the finality of what he had set in motion. The storm outside his window seemed quieter now, as if pausing to consider what came next. His advisors had dispersed, the war room emptied, but the real battle was only beginning. One fought not in chambers or conference rooms, but in the court of public conscience. Sleep eluded him that night. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the curtains. Hours passed in silence until, driven by a need he couldn't name, J.D. took up his coat and stepped out into the night. The streets of Washington were hushed at that hour. The bustle of the day faded into soft echoes. He walked without aim at first, hands in his pockets, head bowed against the chill. The faces of those he had sought to protect rose in his mind. Not by name, not by title, but as the countless unseen. The factory worker keeping the night shift going, the soldier stationed far from home, the child asleep in a small town who would never know how many times unseen hands had kept the shadows at bay. J.D.'s steps, almost without thought, carried him to the Lincoln Memorial. The great statue loomed above him, bathed in pale light, its expression as solemn and steady as the nation it watched over. J.D. stood there for a long time, the marble steps cold beneath his feet, the silence profound. The weight of what he had done and what he was about to face pressed heavy on his chest. He lifted his eyes to Lincoln's face, the lines of care carved into stone, the posture of a man who had borne burdens few could understand. And in the quiet, J.D. found his voice, low and rough with fatigue and feeling. "What would you do?" he whispered to the statue, as if the stone might speak, as if the echoes of history could offer counsel. There was no answer, of course, just the hush of the night, the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze, the steady, unblinking gaze of a leader long gone, but never absent. J.D. drew a breath, filling his lungs with the cool night air, and let it out slowly. The decision had been made, the path set. Whatever came next, he would face it as he had faced every test before, with resolve, with honesty, and with the loyalty that had been his compass from the beginning. And as he turned from the memorial, the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, painting the city in soft gold. The storm was far from over. But J.D. Vance walked back into the coming day with his purpose clear, the hidden truth on its way to light. The walk back from the Lincoln Memorial had offered J.D. a kind of quiet clarity, but no peace. The first hints of dawn stretched across the horizon, washing the darkened streets of Washington in a pale, expectant light. J.D. stepped inside his home, the door clicking shut behind him like the final note of a long, heavy song. The house was still, his wife asleep, the world outside holding its breath. He stood in the front hall, coat in hand, knowing that whatever sleep might have been possible was lost to him now. And then the phone rang. The sound was sharp in the hush, startling in its timing, as if fate itself had chosen that precise moment to speak. J.D. crossed the room in 2 strides, lifting the receiver with a steady hand that belied the storm within. The voice on the other end was clipped, formal, a senior official he'd dealt with many times before, but never like this. "Senator Vance, The clearance has been granted. The documents will be prepared for release at your discretion. There was no ceremony, no pause for congratulations or reassurances, just those words, flat and final, carrying the weight of what they meant. JD closed his eyes for a brief moment, absorbing them. Relief flooded through him first. A wave of it, as if a dam had broken inside his chest. But almost as quickly, it was chased by anxiety, sharp and insistent. The truth was his to reveal now. But how? How to do it in a way that honored those still in the shadows, those who had risked far more than political capital? How to speak the truth without compromising it? "Thank you," JD said, his voice low, the words simple but sincere. The call ended. The line went dead, and JD was left standing there, the weight of that decision settling heavy on his shoulders once more. He moved to his study, where the lamp on his desk cast a soft circle of light against the dark. He didn't turn on the overheads. The quiet suited him now, the small pool of light somehow more fitting for the task ahead. On the desk, framed in glass, the folded flag from his father's funeral rested where it always had, a silent sentinel over his work. JD's gaze lingered on it as he lowered himself into the chair. The stars and stripes seemed to glint in the lamplight, the deep blue and crisp white a reminder of why this mattered, of who he was trying to protect. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and took up his pen. No speechwriters tonight, no teleprompters, just his hand, his heart, and the truth. The pen scratched softly across the page, line after line taking shape. But often he paused, the ink drying mid-sentence as his eyes lifted again to the flag, as if seeking guidance in its folds. The words didn't come easy. They couldn't. This wasn't just a statement, it was a reckoning. He wrote of duty, of the unseen work done in the name of a nation that sometimes doubted those who served it most. He wrote of loyalty, not as a word brandished in hearings or headlines, but as a quiet force, proven not in applause but in action. And as the dawn brightened beyond the window, casting gold across the Capitol dome in the distance, JD knew that soon the world would hear that truth. The storm would rage again, but this time he would meet it not with silence, but with the weight of what was real and right. The first draft of JD's speech lay on his desk, ink still drying, as the city beyond his window stirred with the promise of a new day. But the weight in his chest had not lifted. The words he'd written were true, shaped from conviction and duty. But before he could give them voice, JD needed to stand on ground that reminded him why he fought. He rose, shoulders squared by the resolve that had carried him through the long night, and stepped out into the cool, fragile dawn. The streets of Washington were quiet in that fleeting hour when night yields to day. The city's usual clamor had not yet begun. No motorcades snarled the avenues. No crowds pressed at barricades. Only the hush of a world not yet awake accompanied JD's steady footsteps. His destination lay a short distance from the heart of power, a place where the noise of politics gave way to the silence of sacrifice. The military cemetery unfolded before him as he approached, rows upon rows of white markers catching the first blush of sunlight. The grass, damp with morning dew, glistened like silver. JD paused at the gates, drawing a slow, deep breath, the chill of the air filling his lungs and sharpening his senses. Here, among these stones, there were no cameras, no headlines, no debates. Just the names, and sometimes the absence of names, of those who had given everything. He moved among the headstones without haste, as if each deserved a moment's silent acknowledgement. And then he found it, the marker that always drew him. The grave was plain, its only inscription a single word that carried the weight of so many untold stories. Unknown. JD knelt, the coolness of the earth seeping through his trouser leg, and placed the single white flower he had carried all the way from his home gently at its base. His fingers lingered on the cold stone, as if the connection, however brief, might steady him for what was to come. "For them I speak," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet. The words were not for the cameras, or the critics, or the crowds who would soon dissect his every sentence. They were a vow, one that bound him not to politics, but to the people for whom politics was supposed to matter most. The ones who didn't sit in hearing rooms or draft legislation, but who bore the weight of a nation's choices all the same. Rising JD let his gaze sweep the horizon, the sun now climbing higher, casting long golden beams that touched the Capitol dome in the distance. The streets he walked back along were still mostly empty, but the city was waking, slowly, surely, as if sensing the storm that was about to break. JD's steps were steady, his purpose clear. With each stride, the doubts that had plagued the night fell away, replaced by the certainty that the path he had chosen, difficult though it was the only one that honored those who could no longer speak for themselves. By the time he reached the steps of the Capitol, the first murmurs of the day's business stirred within its walls. JD paused for a moment at the base, looking up at the grand facade, the symbol of a nation's ideals. The storm was near now, closer than ever. But in the calm before it broke, JD Vance stood ready, not as a man defending himself, but as one determined to defend the truth. While JD's footsteps echoed through the quiet streets, Kamala Harris's team was already wide awake, gathered in a sleek conference room not far from the Capitol. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation, the kind that comes not from fear, but from the confidence of a plan meticulously laid. The polished table was covered with laptops, tablets, coffee cups, and neatly printed talking points. On a large screen at the end of the room scrolled live coverage, anchors speculating, headlines updating in real time, social media feeds ablaze with commentary and conjecture. Kamala stood at the head of the table, calm, focused, her gaze sweeping the room as her aides spoke in rapid succession. "We have the key sound bites ready for the networks," one advisor reported. "The phrase national loyalty under scrutiny is trending. If we can tie his votes to foreign interests in this next round, we'll own the narrative." Another aide tapped on her tablet, the glow reflecting off determined eyes. "Draft op-eds are prepped. They'll hit the digital editions within an hour of the hearing's close. Headlines are ready too. Vance dodges again, loyalty in question, a senator on the edge." She looked up, waiting for Kamala's nod, which came without hesitation. It was all choreographed. The lines, the timing, the cascade of commentary that would follow. The aim wasn't just to press JD on his votes, but to corner him so tightly that any answer he gave would seem evasive or damaging. The trap was set. Now it was simply a matter of execution. "We can't underestimate him," Kamala reminded the room, her voice even but firm. "He'll come prepared. He always does. But we set the stage. We frame the debate. Let him talk, then we control what the nation hears." The team nodded, the hum of printers spitting out briefing sheets blending with the steady tap of keys as final edits were made. Outside, the sun continued its slow climb, gilding the city in light that felt almost at odds with the storm gathering in these quiet corridors of power. Across town, JD sat in his office, the early morning rays slanting through the window, casting long stripes across his desk. The folders that had once seemed heavy with secrets now lay open before him, their contents no longer hidden, their truths soon to be spoken. The speech he had written in the lonely hours of the night rested beside them, its edges worn from the touch of his hands, the ink smudged where he had paused too long, lost in thought. He read through it one last time, each word a promise, each line a stake planted in the ground. His fingers lingered on the flag on his desk, the symbol of the father he had lost, the nation he had pledged to serve, the loyalty no accusation could steal. Outside, the city stirred to life, the noise building, the storm drawing near. There was no turning back now. JD rose, gathering the documents, the speech, the weight of what was to come. The next hearing awaited, and with it, the chance to meet the storm head-on, armed not with sound bites or strategy, but with truth. The sun had fully risen by the time JD entered the chamber again, its golden light spilling through the high windows and glinting off polished brass railings. But the glow did nothing to soften the mood inside. The room, already charged during the last session, now pulsed with an even sharper intensity. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the air heavy with anticipation. Staffers stood pressed against the back walls, Reporters jostled for position along the edges, and cameras tracked JD's every movement as he made his way to his seat. It felt less like a hearing now and more like a trial, with the nation watching. Kamala Harris sat poised at the dais, a picture of calm authority, but beneath that stillness was the unmistakable energy of someone ready to strike. The quiet hum of conversation faded as the gavel came down, and in that instant, the room belonged to her. The script was set, the stage prepared. Now she would deliver. Her opening remarks began with a veneer of formality, a nod to procedure, but it wasn't long before the steel beneath showed through. Before we proceed, I want to remind this chamber and the American people why we are here today. We are here because our duty demands it, because loyalty to this country, to its principles and its people, is not optional. It is essential. And when questions arise, as they have, it is our obligation to seek answers, no matter how uncomfortable. She let the words hang, her gaze sweeping the chamber, inviting all to share in the weight of what she had just said. Then she turned her focus squarely on JD, her tone sharpening, the courtesy of her earlier speeches stripped away. "Senator Vance," she said, voice steady but cutting, "you have had time to reflect. Time to consider the gravity of the concerns raised. This chamber, and the citizens who entrusted us with their hopes, their safety, deserve clarity. So let me ask again, will you explain to this body and to the people of the United States how your recent actions serve the interests of our nation?" The question, though framed politely, was a challenge, one meant to put JD on the defensive before he even spoke. The gallery seemed to lean forward as one, the quiet punctuated only by the soft whir of cameras capturing every detail. The set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands folded on the table, the calm that masked the storm within. JD listened without flinching, his expression unreadable, his body language giving nothing away. He did not glance at his papers, did not shift in his seat. He simply met Kamala's gaze, steady and unwavering, and let the words wash over him. The moment was hers for now, but his would come. The room held its breath, waiting for his reply, waiting for the clash they all knew was coming. But JD did not rush. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than any speech. And in that silence, he gathered the strength not just to answer, but to change the course of the storm bearing down upon him. For a heartbeat, the room held still, the kind of stillness that comes just before the world shifts. The eyes of the chamber were fixed on JD Vance, waiting for him to speak, to defend, to falter. But JD did not falter. He rose slowly, deliberately, his movements measured, as if the weight of what he was about to reveal deserved no less. The papers he had guarded so carefully, the ones that bore the stamp of declassification, rested beneath his fingertips, steady on the polished table. When he spoke, his voice carried through the chamber, not with volume, but with clarity, the kind of clarity that cut through noise like a bell in the fog. "Madam Vice President, members of this chamber, and to the citizens watching, I have listened to your concerns, your questions, your doubts, and now it is time I speak not with defense, but with truth." A murmur rippled through the gallery, but JD did not waver. His gaze met Kamala's, steady, unflinching, not in defiance but in resolve. "You asked about my loyalty. You questioned where I stand. So let me tell you plainly where I have stood these past months." His hand lifted the first document, and he held it up for all to see, the declassification seal bold at the top. "Behind closed doors, I served as part of a bipartisan task force tasked with preventing what would have been the most devastating cyber attack on American soil in our history. An attack that, had it succeeded, would have crippled our infrastructure, compromised our defense systems, and endangered millions of lives." The room grew quieter still, the weight of his words settling over the chamber like a shroud. JD let the truth sink in before he continued. This mission was not partisan. It was not for profit. It was not for applause. And it was funded in part by measures that you yourself, Madam Vice President, voted to support. His voice softened, but the steel beneath remained. While you questioned my loyalty, he said, the words measured, powerful, I was defending yours. He stepped forward, the documents in hand, and placed them on the table before him. The papers made a soft, final sound as they met the wood, but the impact was deafening. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, with shock, with revelation, with the sudden, undeniable understanding that the narrative of the past days had just shifted beneath their feet. Kamala's expression held, composed as ever, but the stillness in her eyes spoke of the blow she had not expected. Around the chamber, senators exchanged looks, some stunned, some ashamed, some simply processing the magnitude of what they had just heard. In the gallery, the audience that had come hungry for a clash now sat frozen, bearing witness to something greater. The truth, laid bare, without fanfare, without spin. J.D. did not gloat, he did not smirk, he did not gesture for applause. He simply stood there, the weight of his duty fulfilled, his loyalty proven not in words alone, but in action, in the very deeds that no one had seen until now. The cameras captured it all. The documents, the faces, the moment a chamber built on noise fell into rare, profound silence. And as J.D. lowered himself back into his seat, hands resting calmly on the table, he knew that whatever storm still lay ahead, he had met this one with what mattered most, the truth. For a breathless moment, the chamber remained suspended in that heavy, loaded silence. Then, as if released from a spell, the gallery erupted, first in low murmurs, then in rising waves of reaction that rolled through the room. A few clapped tentatively at first, then more followed, until the space echoed with the sound of hands meeting in spontaneous applause, a rare breach of decorum that no one dared interrupt. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it carried a kind of reverence, as if those present knew they had witnessed something beyond politics. Something that would linger in memory long after headlines faded. Kamala Harris sat motionless at the dais, her features composed, but the shift in her eyes betrayed what words could not. The confidence, the command she had exuded so effortlessly at the opening of the hearing, flickered now under the weight of the truth J.D. had placed before them. She could have spoken. There were lines she had prepared, counters her team had drafted, questions that might have steered the moment back into familiar territory, but none of them fit. Any response now would sound hollow, forced, a footnote to a truth that had spoken for itself. J.D., for his part, remained still through the aftershock, allowing the applause to swell and fade without reaction. He didn't smile. He didn't seek the approval washing over him. His head remained high, his gaze steady, his presence grounded not in the praise of the moment, but in the certainty that he had done what needed to be done. And when it was clear there was no more to say, no further accusations to answer, he gathered his papers, the ones that no longer needed to be hidden, and rose. The exit was not hurried, nor was it dramatic. J.D. walked from the chamber with the same measured purpose he had brought into it, each step deliberate, as if to remind himself that the work was far from over. Behind him, the murmurs began again, not of judgment now, but of reckoning, of senators and staffers and citizens alike turning over in their minds what they had just seen, what it meant, what it changed. Reporters surged toward the door as J.D. emerged into the corridor, a wave of cameras, microphones, and questions that clashed against him like a tide against rock. Senator Vance, do you feel vindicated? Was this your plan all along? How do you respond to those who say this was political theater? The voices overlapped, eager, demanding, hungry for a soundbite that could match the gravity of what had unfolded inside. But J.D. offered none. He moved through the chaos with quiet dignity, his focus forward, his thoughts already turning to the road ahead. The documents, now public, would speak for themselves. The truth at last was free to stand on its own. The clamor of the reporters, the flash of cameras, the rush of the crowd, they were noise. The real work, the real fight, lay beyond their reach, in the hearts and minds of those who would decide, in time, what loyalty meant. And as J.D. disappeared down the corridor, the sound of his steady footsteps was lost beneath the rising hum of a city that had just witnessed the moment the storm broke. and the man who had weathered it without flinching. The city settled into night, but the storm JD had weathered in the chamber rippled far beyond its walls. While he slept, or tried to, in the restless hours before dawn, the machinery of media spun a new narrative, one JD had not sought, but which had found him all the same. Screens glowed in newsrooms and living rooms alike, banners rewritten, commentary reframed. By morning, the headlines told a different story. Vance, the silent defender. Loyalty question backfires. A senator's truth stuns the nation. The clips played on loop across networks. The moment JD rose, the weight in his voice, the calm with which he laid the documents down. Gone were the images of a man on the defensive, replaced by those of a man standing steady in the eye of the storm. The words that had been used to question him now served as markers of the challenge he had met and overcome. Commentators who had, only a day before, filled hours with speculation about his loyalty now found themselves reevaluating, recalibrating. Whatever you think of his politics, one prominent anchor said, voice softer than usual, tonight JD Vance showed the country something we rarely see, the strength of quiet conviction. And while the airwaves hummed with analysis, JD's phone filled with messages, not the frantic pings of staffers or the guarded notes of colleagues trying to reposition themselves, but the voices of those who mattered most, the people he had always fought to serve. Veterans wrote with simple words, but ones that carried deep weight. Thank you for speaking for us. You did right. Steelworkers from towns like Middletown, where loyalty was measured in deeds, not declarations, sent notes of pride. You stood up the way we hoped you would. That was for all of us. And teachers, from city classrooms and rural schools alike, reached out with messages that spoke to the next generation. Our students are watching. You gave them an example worth remembering. JD read them in the quiet of his study, the morning light creeping across his desk, touching the folded flag that had watched over him through every battle. He felt the weight of their words more deeply than any applause that had echoed in the chamber. Because these voices, uncoached, uncoerced, uncalculated, were the voices that had always mattered most to him. He knew the storm wasn't over. He knew the next steps would be as hard, if not harder, than those that had come before. The truth he had revealed would bring consequences, scrutiny, questions, perhaps new battles he couldn't yet see. But for this moment at least, the tide had turned. The storm that had threatened to define him with a lie had instead illuminated the truth. And as the city outside stirred fully awake, JD sat a little straighter, the glow of dawn on his face, his resolve renewed. The headlines had flipped, yes. But what mattered more was what came next. Not the praise, not the vindication, but the work still to be done. The work of living up to the loyalty he had spoken of, the loyalty he had shown, and the loyalty the people who believed in him deserved. The glow of the headlines, the flood of messages, the swell of public support, they could not erase the cost. JD knew at the moment he rose from his desk that morning, the weight of the decision pressing on him in ways applause could never lighten. The storm he had met head-on had cleared the air in public, but in private, another reckoning waited. The truth had set him free in the eyes of many, but it had also opened doors that were meant to stay closed, revealed details meant to remain in the shadows. He felt it in the silence that followed the surge of praise, a quieter, more complicated silence that came from those who moved in the world of secrets and safeguards, of plans whispered in secure rooms, of missions that succeeded because no one ever knew they happened. He felt it in the uneasy pause on the other end of calls that once began with easy camaraderie, and he felt it most of all when he decided, before the day was out, that he owed certain people a visit. The Pentagon stood as it always did, solid, imposing, a fortress of purpose. JD walked its corridors with the steady step of a man who had come to account for himself, not to explain away his actions, but to look in the eyes of those who would feel their impact most keenly. He moved past security, past offices where strategy was drafted and debated, past faces that had once greeted him with nods of shared mission. Now those nods came more hesitantly. Some nodded still, their expressions tight but respectful, as if acknowledging both the choice and the cost. Others avoided his gaze, their eyes fixed on papers, screens, anything but the man who had made public what they had worked so hard to keep shielded. JD understood. He did not expect thanks. He did not seek absolution. He had made his choice, knowing the weight of it, and he bore it now without flinching. He paused outside one particular office, the door half open, voices low within. The people inside had stood beside him in that task force, had trusted him as he had trusted them. He considered stepping inside, considered speaking the words that pressed at the back of his throat. But he did not. There were no words that could mend what was done, not yet. Instead, he stood for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of their work, then moved on. Outside, the air was crisp, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grounds. JD breathed it in, the coolness grounding him, the ache of bittersweet victory settling deep. The headlines had flipped, the narrative had changed, but the bonds behind the scenes, some frayed, some perhaps broken, were the real markers of what had been won and what had been lost. As he walked away from the building, his reflection trailed behind him in the polished windows, a reminder that the man the nation now praised was also the man who had made a choice with no easy ending. The work ahead would be harder in some ways than what had come before, but JD had never chosen the easy path, and as the Pentagon receded behind him, he carried forward not with regret, but with resolve, to honor both the truth he had spoken and the trust he would have to rebuild. The evening light slanted across JD's study as he returned home, the golden hue softening the edges of a day that had tested him in ways few could see. The house, quiet and familiar, offered a measure of peace that the grand halls of power never could. JD set his jacket aside, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders, and moved toward his desk, where the day's mail had been stacked neatly by his wife. Among the official envelopes and typed notes, one caught his eye. A plain white envelope, the handwriting uneven, uncertain, but heartfelt in a way no speech could match. JD opened it slowly, carefully unfolding the lined paper inside. The words were simple, but they stopped him cold, their honesty cutting through the noise of politics and headlines like sunlight through storm clouds. "Dear Senator Vance," it began, "my name is Ethan. I'm 12 years old. I live in Ohio. I watched what you said. You made me believe in America again." The boy's words filled the page in blocky letters, each line carrying more weight than volumes of editorials. "My dad lost his job last year. My mom works nights. I didn't think anybody cared about people like us anymore. But when you stood up in that hearing, it felt like you were talking for people like my family. My dad said you did a brave thing. I think so too." JD read the letter twice, then a third time, the edges soft beneath his fingertips, his throat tight with the kind of emotion that no victory speech could summon. The storm, the scrutiny, the private costs, they all seemed to fall away in that moment, replaced by the quiet, humbling truth of why he had chosen this path in the first place. Not for power, not for praise, but for the Ethans of the world, those who still looked for proof that their voices mattered. Without thinking, JD reached for the folded flag that sat in its case on the corner of his desk. His father's flag, the one that had watched over him through every battle, every decision, every sleepless night. He placed the boy's letter beside it, as if offering it to the memory of the man who had taught him what service meant. The flag and the letter together spoke of the same promise, that loyalty wasn't loud and it wasn't easy, but it was worth everything. Outside, the first stars pricked the deepening sky, and JD sat in the quiet, the letter resting under his hand, the weight of it light, but profound. The storm was not over. The work was far from done. But in this moment, JD Vance allowed himself a breath of peace and a reminder of what made the fight matter. The bell rang softly in a quiet high school classroom, the kind of sound that usually signaled restless movement, chatter, the shuffle of papers and books. But today, the room remained still. The students, juniors in civics, sat watching the screen at the front of the room as J.D. Vance's speech played again. The moment he had stood, documents in hand, and spoken the words that had turned the storm on its head. The video had made its way into classrooms across the country, not as a political statement, but as an example of something older and deeper, the quiet power of integrity. The teacher, a woman in her early 40s with a voice that could command attention without raising its volume, let the clip finish before pausing the video. The room stayed silent for a beat longer, the weight of what the students had witnessed settling over them in that rare way that only truth could. A boy at the back raised his hand. His face was thoughtful, his tone uncertain, as if the question had formed only as he heard himself speak it. Is that what loyalty means? The teacher smiled gently, pleased not just by the question, but by the sincerity behind it. She crossed her arms, leaning slightly against the desk, considering her answer. That's one kind of loyalty, she said, and probably the hardest kind. The kind where you do what's right not because it's easy or because it wins you applause, but because it's who you are, even when no one's watching, even when it costs you. She let her gaze sweep the room, making sure the words landed. That's the kind that lasts. Outside the window, the autumn sun slanted across the schoolyard, casting long shadows that mirrored those inside. Young people grappling with ideas that would shape the kind of citizens they'd become. The teacher let the moment linger, then moved to switch off the screen, leaving the room in thoughtful quiet as the lesson drew to a close. Across the city as dusk approached, J.D. Vance walked the Capitol grounds, his hands in his pockets, his head bowed slightly against the crisp evening air. The day's noise had faded, replaced by the softer sounds of workers sweeping the steps, securing the grounds, preparing the building for another day's business. J.D. watched them for a moment, unseen, unnoticed, and felt a quiet kinship with their steady, uncelebrated work. His thoughts drifted as he walked, his steps slow, deliberate. Leadership isn't loud, he reflected, the words forming not as a statement for others, but as a reminder for himself. Loyalty isn't loud, but both endure longer than the noise. The headlines had already begun to shift again, the media's attention drawn by newer storms, fresher battles. But the work of standing for something, that work never ended, never faded with the news cycle. It remained steady as the marble beneath his feet, as the flag that fluttered softly above the dome in the dying light of day. Later, back in his office, J.D. sat alone at his desk. The room was quiet, the hour late, but the light of his lamp cast a warm circle over the microphone before him. No script waited on the table, no prepared remarks. Just the truth and the voice he carried. He hit record, letting the silence settle for a moment before speaking. His words came low, steady, with the weight of all that had come before. You can question my loyalty, he said, each syllable measured, not defiant, not defensive, but resolute. But you can't question the loyalty of the people I stood for, the people who do the hard work, the people who carry this country forward every day without asking for credit, without expecting applause, the people who taught me what it means to belong to something greater than yourself. That's the loyalty I spoke for. That's the loyalty I will always speak for. He paused, letting the words linger, knowing that whoever listened would hear not just his voice, but the voices of all those he carried with him. The recording clicked to an end, but J.D. sat a while longer, staring out at the city beyond his window. Outside, the flag at a nearby building flew at half-staff for an officer who had fallen in the line of duty, a quiet reminder that the fight for truth, for justice, for loyalty continued far beyond any single speech or hearing. J.D. watched the flag stir in the breeze, the city's lights flickering on one by one, and felt the familiar, steadying weight of responsibility settle in again. The storm might pass, the headlines might fade, but the work would go on, and he would be there to meet it, quietly, steadfastly, as he always had. This story reminds us that true loyalty is often quiet, proven not through grand speeches, but through hard choices made when no one is watching. J.D.'s stand shows that leadership isn't about seeking applause. It's about carrying the weight of truth, even when the cost is high. His journey inspires us to think about the values we hold, the promises we make, and the courage it takes to stay true to both. In the end, it's not the noise of critics or the glare of headlines that defines us, but the quiet moments where we choose what's right. What does loyalty mean to you? And when in your life have you seen it tested? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.